What if your body isn't failing? What if we've misunderstood what health is supposed to be? Before we get into this, I want to give you a quick orientation to where we're going today. We're going to look at something most of us think we already understand: health. More specifically, what we unconsciously believe a healthy person is supposed to feel like, look like, and function like. We are going to look at why so many people feel pressure to stay productive, focused, emotionally steady, and high functioning almost all of the time. How that shapes the way we relate to fatigue, stress, rest, and recovery. Why regulation is often misunderstood, and what might change if we stop treating health as a fixed state to maintain, and instead look at it from a wider and perhaps more fundamental orientation, one that helps us see what the body may actually be trying to do. Because many of the assumptions we carry about health are so normalized, we rarely stop to question them. Most people unconsciously define healthy as something like this: productive, focused, clear-minded, emotionally steady, energetic, available, calm under pressure. Most of the time, with only brief interruptions for sleep, weekends, vacation, and maybe some carefully scheduled self-care. When we drift outside of that narrow range, when we feel fatigue, brain fog, overwhelm, withdrawal, low motivation, the need to slow down, it starts to feel like something has gone wrong. But what's interesting is that our definition of health has changed constantly throughout history. There were even periods where body types we would now consider completely normal were labeled unhealthy, abnormal, or even diseased. There have been shifting ideas about ideal weight, ideal behavior, ideal emotional expression, ideal performance, ideal lifestyle. And for heaven's sake, there was a time physicians promoted cigarette smoking. So part of the problem now is that many people are trying to reach some imagined correct version of health without ever stopping to ask, what are we actually aiming for? Because maybe health was never supposed to be a fixed target in the first place. Maybe the problem is not that we're failing to achieve health, but that we've misunderstood what a healthy human system actually looks like. Because underneath a lot of modern cultures, this unspoken assumption that a healthy person should remain productive, emotionally steady, mentally sharp, physically energized, and socially available most of the time. This is where a lot of optimization culture enters. Not because tools are bad, or not because routines are bad, and not because wanting to feel good is wrong, but because many people are trying to maintain one preferred state indefinitely. So rest becomes just enough recovery to return to productivity. Meditation becomes a way to become more efficient. And even regulation, which has become a huge buzzword recently, can quietly become another attempt to force the system to remain inside one narrow band of acceptable states. Equal parts hustle and bath salts. The goal quietly becomes, how do I regulate myself enough to keep performing? But that's not really what regulation is in a living system. Regulation is not always calm, or always positive, or always productive, always clear, always in control. A regulated system experiences stress, fatigue, grief, activation, emotion, uncertainty, human living. The difference is not that those states never happen when you're regulated. The difference is that the system can move through them without becoming trapped there. Because human beings don't actually work the way many of us have been taught to think they should. We are not designed to feel focused, productive, clear, energetic, socially available, emotionally neutral all of the time. There are going to be periods naturally of high energy and lower energy, engagement and withdrawal, stress and recovery, clarity and fogginess, movement outward and movement inward. That shifting is not a flaw in the system. That shifting is the system. The body is already moving. The question is whether we understand that movement or spend enormous energy fighting it. And this is where many people get trapped. Because when certain states feel unacceptable, fatigue or slowing down, sadness, grief, uncertainty, the need for withdrawal, we often begin organizing ourselves around resisting those states. We push past exhaustion. We stay available. We keep performing, keep producing, sometimes for years. Externally, that can look highly functional, but internally, the system may be spending enormous energy overriding its own signals and its own ways of adapting to challenges. So what we often call high functioning is not necessarily a sign of health. Sometimes it's a sign that the body's attempts to recover, to slow down, feel, or rebalance are continuously being suppressed. And eventually, the cost of that suppression starts showing up. We see fatigue, anxiety, shutdown, brain fog, irritability, loss of meaning, loss of capacity. Not because the body's failing, but because it's been forced to remain inside one narrow mode of operating for too long. Over time, this creates fragmentation, fragmented attention, fragmented recovery, fragmented signaling, fragmented relationship with the body itself, and fragmentation consumes enormous energy. Because the system is constantly working to hold together competing demands, overriding internal signals, and maintain one acceptable version of functioning. I think we've also confused functioning with performing, because culturally, functioning often does mean keeping up and staying productive, holding everything together, continuing to meet expectations. But a living body is not a machine designed to maintain one output state indefinitely. A living system is constantly responding, adjusting, recovering, mobilizing, conserving, reconnecting. That movement is part of health. So from the body's perspective, needing rest after prolonged stress makes sense. Withdrawal after overwhelm can make sense. Low energy after long periods of overexertion can make sense. Even shutdown can sometimes make sense as the system attempts protection or conservation. Not ideal, not pleasant, and not where we want to remain, but understandable. And different from automatically assuming every difficult state means the body's broken. A disease process is always the entire explanation, where the system is simply malfunctioning and in need of correction. Of course, symptoms absolutely can require medical evaluation and treatment, but sometimes what we interpret as only pathology may include adaptive responses occurring inside overwhelmed systems. This is where capacity starts to make a lot more sense, because capacity is not simply how much you can do, it's how much you can and are already holding. Many people think they have a productivity problem when actually they have an accumulated load problem. And sustainable capacity does not emerge from alternating overwork with recovery rituals. It does not come from burnout then collapse, then vacation, rinse and repeat. Sustainable capacity grows when activation and recovery become rhythmic enough that there's consistent support for the body's natural adaptive movement, and the system no longer experiences output itself as threat. That dynamic is so important and so fundamental that we'll spend more time with it in another video. But I want to say it again. Sustainable capacity grows when regulation, flexible movement through states, becomes predictable and rhythmic enough that there's consistent support for the body's natural adaptive movement, and the system no longer experiences output itself as threat. Flexible movement for adaptation becomes regular. That's regulation. This doesn't mean we suppress ambition or avoid intensity or abandon fitness goals. It means we remain in relationship with capacity when we enter high input states, become aware of the body's signaling need for shifts, and move flexibly through adaptive changes instead of overriding them until adaptation is eventually forced through a dysregulated dynamic. The body will adapt one way or another. In some ways, all roads lead to Rome. The question is whether adaptation happens through a more coherent and supported process or through increasing fragmentation, override, depletion, and dysregulation. Because regulation is not the absence of challenge, it's a more coherent and supported path through challenge, like a highway with clear road markers and enough fuel, places to stop and recover, the ability to speed up and slow down when conditions change, windshield wipers when it rains, and enough presence to actually experience the scenery along the way. Dysregulation could feel more like an episode of Survivor. You're hacking through the underbrush, exhausted, starving, fighting off mosquitoes and tigers, and trying to navigate without a map. Both paths may eventually lead to adaptation, but the energetic cost is radically different. For many people, this is where things finally begin to make more sense, because they realize the problem was not simply lack of information or lack of effort, lack of discipline, or lack of insight. The body was already signaling. The system was already attempting to adapt. But without understanding state, capacity, regulation as flexibly moving through the wide range of human states, internal load, and the chronic cost of self-override and the disconnect from the body's innate rhythms, many people spend years fighting the very responses that may have been trying to protect or rebalance them. And this changes the way we think about health entirely, because now the question is no longer, how do I achieve the ideal state I believe is good health? How do I find the correct target and the right protocol to hit it? Now the questions become, how regulated am I? How easily am I moving through states? Am I allowing adequate recovery, healthy activation? How much am I already holding? Am I matching my response to challenges with the state and capacity I'm actually aware of? This is where decision making starts to change, because awareness of state matters. Awareness of capacity matters. Understanding regulation matters, not as keep everything calm and productive, but as learning to move with the body's states more flexibly, recognizing where and when internal resistance develops, understanding the load that resistance creates, and recognizing the body signaling more clearly. This is also where modern healthcare and wellness can start to feel disconnecting for many people, not necessarily because the models are wrong, but because many of them are incomplete. They often focus on symptoms, performance, optimization, behavior, or diagnosis, without fully accounting for state, capacity, internal load, and the body's signaling. They don't often account for our relationship with different human states. And now we're beginning to see more of the picture with newer understanding of how more of these pieces of human physiology actually fit together, not as isolated systems, but as living patterns of adaptation, protection, recovery, response, rhythm, and relationship. In the next videos, we're going to look more closely at how the body signals changing needs, how to recognize when we're overriding rather than adapting, why pacing and recovery matter, how regulation becomes visible in ordinary daily life. And eventually, all of this leads to a much deeper conversation about what safety for a human being actually means. Not just psychologically, but physiologically. And if some of these ideas feel new or unfamiliar, I'd especially recommend going back to the earlier video, Why Awareness Isn't Enough. Because understanding state, capacity, and regulation lays important groundwork for everything we explored today. If this resonates, there's more on this at lumenhealth.online. And you're welcome to stay with this as it unfolds.